Hey, how's it going everybody? Hope you're all doing well. Welcome to part 8 on a series where I show you how to build a simple modern habit tracker called consistency. So in the last video, we basically used this package called Express Validator to handle any of the errors that could come up from user registration. And we displayed the errors like so. In this video, we're going to continue building out this feature. And I want to particularly focus on password encryption and database setup. These are two very important concepts to understand and are absolutely necessary for setting up a full user authentication system. So the first thing we need to do is use a package called bcrypt for password encryption. So let's jump into it. So what is bcrypt? Well, it's basically a library that helps you hash passwords. Now, what does it mean to actually hash a password? Essentially, when the user enters a password and we receive it on our backend, we don't want to just store the string they entered into our database because there's obviously some security risks there, right? Anybody who has access to the database can basically see everybody's passwords. And so a hash is basically a string that's generated from the original password into a string that contains a bunch of random letters and numbers. And the idea is you can't take the hash and get the original password back. And so this library is really going to help us because it basically does all the heavy lifting of encryption for you. So let's take this npm install command, go to the backend folder of our project and paste that npm install command. All right, so we have that installed now. Let's now go to our backend code in the user routes file and import bcrypt from bcrypt. Now, how do we actually use this library? Well, they make it pretty straightforward in their documentation. We need to set a number called salt rounds, which I'll explain in just a minute. We take the original plain text password that the user entered, and we use a function called bcrypt.hash to generate the password hash. So let's do that. At the top, after router, let's set a const salt rounds equal to 10. So basically, bcrypt will take 2 to the power of whatever salt rounds is, number of iterations to process your password. And so the higher you make your salt rounds value, the more time it's going to take to process your data. All right, so 10 is just kind of a good number to put. It doesn't take too long and it still gives you a very secure hash. So let's continue down in the handler function for the register route. So after this error checking, let's go ahead and get the values that the user entered from the form. We're going to eventually need first name, last name, email, and password. This is coming from request.body. And now we simply just need one line for hashing the password. And we're going to set const password hash equal to await bcrypt.hash. And the first parameter is what string the user entered that we want to hash, which is password that comes from request.body. And the second number is going to be salt rounds. Also, since we have the await keyword here, we need to make this an asynchronous function. So we'll put the keyword async up here before our request and response. By the way, we need the await keyword here because bcrypt.hash is going to take some time to process that value, and we don't want our code to continue until the promise is returned. So anyways, now let's console log the value of password hash just to see what it looks like. So let's save this and submit the registration form. So let's see what happens in our console log. So as you can see here, we get this long string full of letters and numbers, and this is the value that we can safely store into the database. All right, so that basically checks off part 1 and leads nicely into the second part, which is going to be setting up our database. So basically, if you're not familiar with it, Postgres is the relational database management system that we're going to be using to basically permanently store all of the key information that's on our site. So the first thing you need to do is go to this link here, which I'll post in the description, and download version 13.1 for Postgres, which is the one that I currently have, and I downloaded it for Mac. So once you click download, it'll take you through the installation process, and it's pretty straightforward. But one thing I do want to note is make sure that when you're setting up the password for the default Postgres user, which it'll prompt you for, make sure you note down that password, because one time I ended up forgetting that password, and it's just an annoying process to get that reset. I ended up having to uninstall and install Postgres again. So just make sure you note that down. And the next thing we need to do is go into our terminal, and again in the backend folder, we need to install another npm package, and that is pg for Postgres. And we're going to be using this to interface with the Postgres database. Okay, awesome. So once you have the npm package installed and you have Postgres installed, you should now be able to run a command called psql and give it a user. And we're going to be using the default Postgres user that it creates for you. So now enter that password that I mentioned, and you have access to the command line for your database now. So what can you do in here? Here's some examples. If you do \L, it'll give you a list of the databases that's in your system. It'll give you the template and the Postgres databases by default. And you can see I already have one up for my consistency demo. So basically, if I want to create a new database, I can use the SQL command, create database. And I'm going to call mine consistency tutorial. Make sure you put the semicolon here. And we got create table. Let's do \L again. And you can see that we have consistency tutorial here. Now we actually need to connect to this database. So we can go \C consistency tutorial. Okay, cool. Another thing we can do is \DT, which is describe tables. And currently we don't have any relations or any tables in our database yet. So let's create a script in our backend that's going to create those tables for us. So what I'll do here is in my backend folder, I'm going to create a new folder called db. And in here, I'm going to create a new file called setupdb.js.sql. And one thing to note is that for these tutorials, I'm not going to be using any ORM. If you're familiar with that, basically I'm going to be using plain SQL because, well, the SQL that I'm going to be writing isn't going to be too complicated. And for me, I want to just practice the basics for now. So to save you some time, I'm going to copy paste the SQL command that I have for creating the users table. So basically this table is going to store the ID of the user. And we have the keyword serial here, specifically because it's a keyword that's an alias for a big integer that's going to be automatically incremented. And this is going to be our primary key. And obviously we need to store the first name, last name, email, and password hash. And these values are a little bit out of date. So let's change this to 60, this one to 60. The email is going to be 100. And we'll leave the password hash as 255 because the hash can get pretty long. And we also want to make sure that the email is unique. So now that we have this in the setupdb file, let's save it. Go back to our terminal where we are interfacing with the database. I just realized we actually need to be inside of the database folder that we created. And then from here, let's reconnect to the database. psql-u Postgres. And a little shortcut to connect to the database right away is we can just put the name of our database in this command. Okay, so from here, if we use the \I command, and the I is for include, we can run the file that we just wrote. There we go, we got the create table. And now if we go DT for describe table, we can see that we have one table called users. All right, so now a question for you guys. Can we go ahead and start writing the SQL code yet? The answer is no, because we haven't created the connection that allows us to interface with the database yet. And so this is what we're going to do. In the database folder, let's create a new file. We'll call it dbconnect.js. And in here, we're going to be using a class that comes from PG, which is that package that we installed earlier. And that's called pool from PG. So pool is basically a class, which once we configure it, will open up a connection to our Postgres server and allow us to run queries on it. So to set that up, we're going to export a constant called pool, and it's going to be equal to new pool. And as you can see, pool takes a config object. So we'll give it an object and some fields. The first one is going to be user. This is going to be Postgres. And the password that we're going to give it is going to be the password that you entered when you were first creating or when you were first installing your instance of Postgres. I gave mine Posty. This is just on my local computer, so it doesn't matter that you guys can see it. For the host, we're going to give it localhost. Port 5432. This is the port that Postgres uses for local machines. Database. And this is going to be the database name. So whatever name you gave it, you can put it here. I gave it consistency tutorial. All right, we can save this file now. And now we can use this const pool over here in other classes. So let's close this file for now. Go to the top of our user routes file and import pool. Import pool from one folder back in the database folder from dbconnect. All right, now we can actually start running queries against the database. Now, there are obviously different ways you can go about doing this. And if you prefer other methods as opposed to what I'm going to be showing you, feel free to comment below and let me know. But this is how I'm going to do it. So after password hash, let's write our query. So I'm going to create const, and I'll call it create user query. because remember, now we have our password hash, we have the information that we need to store. Now we need to write a query to store it. So I'm going to use an object to create my query. And the reason I can do this is because this pool class here allows us to pass objects instead of just a direct query string. So in this object, I'm going to give it a text. This text field is going to be my actual query. So what I want to do is insert into users, which is the table that we created. What columns do I want to insert for? It's going to be first name, last name, email, and password hash. Notice that these column names are obviously the same as the column names of the create table command that we ran earlier. Okay, so what values do we want to associate with those columns? Well, basically we want to use these values here that we're getting from request.body, right? We need to create another property here called values and explicitly give it what values we want to put. I've said the word values way too many times now. Let's just copy those, put them in here. And to reference the variables that are in here, we can use numbers. $1 is going to represent the first name. $2 is going to represent last name. And 3 is going to represent the email. Now, we also want to store the password hash, right? So let's copy the password hash, put it here, and put that as $4. By the way, guys, there is a reason why I'm not directly concatenating the values that we want to add into the string itself. The reason is found on Node Postgres' documentations, because it says if you're passing parameters to your queries, you want to avoid string concatenation into the query text directly. This can and does lead to SQL injection vulnerabilities. So basically, when you put your parameters into this values array over here, Postgres makes sure that your values are substituted into your query in the most safe way. So there's one more thing that we need to complete this query. After it runs up to this part, we have stored the values that we want into the users table. But after the query is done running, we want the query to return the values that it just added. So let's put returning first name, last name, and email. The reason is because we're going to be returning these values back to the user on the front end. Now, instead of returning those values, we could just use the values that we already have from here, but I just want to make sure 100% that the values that we get back are the ones that we put into the database. So that's just my preference. So now we have this query object. Let's actually execute it. So we'll set const query response equal to await. And now we'll use that pool variable that we imported from the other file. And we can call the .query function and simply pass it create user query. Now, as always, let's console log what value that we get back from this just to see if it matches what we expect. Let's save what we have, go back to the front end and send another registration request. Hit register, and let's take a look at the console. Okay, awesome. So we can see here that we have a results object. And this has a bunch of information that's returned from the query, but basically what we want is this item right here called rows. You can see that rows returns the one object it added to that database table. So let's head back to the code. Let's get rid of both of these console logs and set const new user equals query response dot rows. And from the rows, we want number 0, which is the first object right here. And I almost forgot another important chunk of code actually. So the question is, does our code handle a case where this query doesn't execute properly? And the answer is no. So let's put a .catch after the query, put a function in here that will be run if a rejection is returned from the database. And now what do we want to do in here? Well, first of all, let's set res.status to 401, which is an error code. And let's also send a message back to the user. Now, just to stay consistent with the format that we are sending errors back, remember errors up here is an array. So let's also send an array over here. And in that array, we're going to put one object with 2 fields. The first one is going to be param, and this is going to specify, where in the registration process it failed. So we'll just put registration error. I know this name is a little bit vague, but I like to use names like this for any kind of random unexpected error that is not specifically caused by the user. Because remember, we already error checked the fields that the user filled in. By this point, these fields have passed their tests, and whatever error happened here is some other registration error. And we'll be using this name to handle it on the front end as well. Let's also put a message, and that message is going to be unable to add user. So let's save that. And then in the registration file, let's simply copy this error chunk that we have here, put it under the registration title. And for when we find the error, we want to find registration error. Did I spell that right? I think I'm good. So let's send another request. Oh, actually, before we do that, let's manually create a case where an error might pop up. For example, if the first name value isn't even in the values list, this query should fail, right? So let's save this now and hit register. And we see a message unable to add user here. And on the back end, we see in our console that we have more information about the error. All right, so now that we know that our system can handle errors like this, let's add first name back to the list of values over here. And also we can expect that once it gets up to this point, there isn't any error. And so instead of returning this user down here, which is that hard-coded value above, we can get rid of this value. And instead of that, return this response, which is from the database. And let's hit register one more time and make sure that the correct values are in the database that we expect. It redirected, so that's good. And now if you go back to your database in the console, let's run select star from users and see what's actually in that table now. Perfect. So I just registered with this information and we can see that it's been stored here along with the password hash. So this is great. Also, I didn't forget, there's another error check that we can do now since we've set up the database. And that is to check if the email already belongs in the database and make sure there's no duplicates. So let's put another body function. Let's take the email field and run a custom function. This function needs to be async because we're going to be doing a database call. It'll take the email that comes from the body. And now in here, let's write our query. So const query for email equals an object. And just like we did below, let's put a text property. And in here, let's put select email from users. So select the email value from the users table. This should be in caps, from users, where email, as in this email here, equals $1. And remember, if we want to use variables, we're going to put them in the values property. And we want to put email here. So this is just doing a query to search for the email that was entered in the body from the database. Let's execute the query by saving const query response equal to await pool.query query for email. Okay, so now let's actually put the check here. If query response dot rows dot length is greater than 0, if we got more than 0 results back from this query, that means we have a duplicate. So let's throw new error, email already in use. Otherwise, if that's not the case, we can return true and this test passes. Let's put a comma here, save this and hit register with a duplicate email. Hit register and we see that email is already in use. All right, so we can finally check off this step of the video. And we only have one more thing to do, and that is to redirect to the /login page if they're not signed in. So here's what I mean. If you're on the register page and you go /habits, like if you manually type this in, then you're able to access this page right now. But we don't want this behavior, right? We don't want people accessing this page if they're not signed in. And so the idea is we're going to be using a certain state from Redux, which is logged in user. And if this thing is null, then basically we're going to redirect them. If you guys want, you can pause it here and try this on your own as a little exercise if you want to. But I'll show you how to implement it. Let's go back to register for now. And if we go back to our code, let's actually go to the myhabits.jsx file. Here is where we want to implement that redirect feature. So let's save ourselves a little bit of time. We actually already handled redirection in the register file. So I'm going to copy this use effect along with the use history, put it in the myhabits file. And we also need logged in user, user state. Let's put those here as well. And for now, I'm just going to grab all this stuff from this import section, put it in the myhabits file, and just get rid of stuff that I don't need. First of all, let's take this use effect, put it up here with our React, get rid of this entire line. Let's get rid of the link because we don't need that either. We already have styled imported above. We don't need registry user. And we can get rid of this use dispatch too. And for this use effect, if the user is not logged in, then we'll redirect to the sign-in URL. So this looks good. Let's save it. And as you can see, we were just on the My Habits page before, but it redirected us now to /signin. So I'll show you one more time. If we try to go to habits, it'll automatically redirect us to sign in, which is what we want. So that checks off step number 3. But I want to show you an issue that still persists with registration. Let's go to register, hit submit. This works as usual. But if we inspect our Redux state, we see that right now we have logged in user. But if you refresh, you get redirected because the logged in user gets set to null. So essentially, we need some way to persist the logged in user's information within our system. And we're going to be doing that with local storage. But that's going to be part of the next video, along with signing in at some point as well. Anyways, it's been a long week. I'm going to end this video here. I hope you guys found this video useful and maybe learned anything from it. If there's anything that you think I could be doing differently with my code, by all means comment below and let me know. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.